They were the women who seemingly had it all, the wives, mistresses, and daughters of the Third Reich's elite. While Europe burned under the fires of war, these women lived, gilded, lives of unimaginable luxury, funded by the treasury of a predatory state. They were more than just partners. They were carefully crafted symbols of perfect German womanhood, wielding silent but significant power from within the shadowed halls of Berchtesgaden and the high society salons of Berlin. But in May 1945, the music stopped. As the Soviet red banner rose over the Reichstag and the bunker doors closed for the final time, the opulent world of the Nazi first ladies shattered into a million jagged pieces. From the heights of the Eagle's Nest to the squalor of Allied internment camps, their fall from grace was as dramatic as it was total. What happens to the families of monsters when the nightmare ends? How did the spouses of men like Himmler and Goring navigate a world that now viewed their names with absolute horror? Today, we trace a story that spans over 75 years, a journey from the decadent court of Adolf Hitler to the modern day, exploring the complex, often unrepentant lives of the women and children who carried the heaviest names in history. In the secluded sanctuary of the Obersalzberg, far removed from the starving citizens of Germany, life for the Braun sisters was a surreal parade of mountain vistas and high-altitude parties. While Eva Braun remained the secret, unofficial, First Lady of the Reich, her sister Gretel Braun was a fixture of Hitler's inner circle. In June 1944, just 3 days before the Allied storm hit the beaches of Normandy, Gretel married Hermann Fegelein, an SS liaison officer and a personal favorite of Heinrich Himmler. The wedding was a display of peak Nazi decadence, held at Berchtesgaden with Himmler and Martin Bormann as witnesses, followed by a wedding breakfast at the world-famous Eagle's Nest. However, this gilded existence was built on a foundation of quicksand. By January 1945, the war had reached the gates of Berlin. While Gretel stayed at the Obersalzberg due to her pregnancy, Eva returned to the Führerbunker to be with Hitler in his final hours. The tragedy of the Braun family began not with the Red Army, but with internal betrayal. As the Soviet pincers closed on Berlin, Hermann Fegelein committed the ultimate sin in Hitler's eyes: he deserted his post. Fegelein was found by Hitler's bodyguards in his Berlin apartment, intoxicated and preparing to flee with a suitcase full of gold and foreign currency. Despite Eva Braun's desperate pleas for her brother-in-law's life, Hitler was unmoved. Egged on by the manipulative Martin Bormann, Hitler stripped Fegelein of his rank and ordered him executed in the Reich Chancellery Garden. On April 29, 1945, just hours after her husband was shot, Gretel became Hitler's sister-in-law when he finally married Eva Braun in a somber bunker ceremony. The aftermath for Gretel was a bitter mixture of loss and survival. On May 5, 1945, only a week after her sister and brother-in-law committed suicide in Berlin, Gretel gave birth to a daughter, whom she named Eva in memory of her sister. But the past was not easily hidden. In an attempt to preserve the family's legacy, Gretel hid photo albums, jewelry, and private letters between Hitler and Eva at Fischhorn Castle. However, she was eventually outsmarted by a U.S. counterintelligence corps (CIC) agent posing as a refugee. The seizure of these documents provided Allied intelligence with an unprecedented window into the private life of the dictator. Gretel would go on to live a quiet life in post-war Bavaria, marrying a businessman in 1954. Yet, the shadow of the Reich was long. Her daughter, Eva Fegelein, tragically committed suicide in 1971 following the death of her fiancé, a grim echo of the family's violent history. Gretel herself passed away in 1987, suffering from Alzheimer's, taking many of the inner circle's darkest secrets to her grave. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust and the head of the SS, was a man who demanded absolute, racial purity, and strict moral codes from his subordinates. Yet, his own private life was a masterclass in hypocrisy. While his wife, Margaret Himmler, and their daughter Gudrun lived in their Bavarian villa, Himmler maintained a secret second family with his young secretary, Hedwig Pothest. This dual life reflected the wider SS ideology, a cold, administrative exterior masking a deeply fractured personal reality. Among all the children of the Nazi elite, Gudrun Himmler, often called Puppy by her father, stands out as the most unrepentant. As a child, she was the apple of her father's eye, frequently accompanying him on official visits. In a chilling entry in her diary, she described a visit to the Dachau concentration camp not as a sight of horror, but as a pleasant day trip to see the herb gardens. This early exposure to the machinery of death, framed as a noble state enterprise, forged an unbreakable bond between the daughter and the father's dark legacy. When the war ended and Himmler committed suicide in British custody, Gudrun and her mother were arrested by the Americans. They were moved through various internment camps and brought to Nuremberg to testify. For many, this would be a moment of denazification and reflection. For Gudrun, it was the catalyst for a lifelong crusade to vindicate her father. She viewed the Allied victory not as a liberation, but as a personal and national humiliation. In the decades following the war, Gudrun became a neo-Nazi icon in West Germany. She married Wolf-Dieter Berwitz, an official in the right-wing NPD party, and became the leading figure of Stillhilfe, Silent Help. This clandestine organization provided legal and financial aid to former SS officers and war criminals, including notorious figures like Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon. Gudrun was never a passive observer. She was a political operative who used her status as Nazi royalty to keep the flickering embers of the Third Reich alive. While other children of Nazi leaders, like those of Martin Bormann, eventually converted to Catholicism or publicly denounced their father's crimes, Gudrun remained defiant until her death in 2018 at the age of 88. She never apologized, never wavered, and never acknowledged the millions of victims of her father's final solution. Her life serves as a haunting reminder that the ideology of the Reich did not die in the bunker in 1945. It lived on through the devotion of a daughter who chose to remain the Princess of Darkness until the very end. If Himmler was the architect of terror, Martin Bormann was the Brown Eminence, the man who controlled access to Hitler himself. His family life was a bizarre reflection of Nazi fanatical devotion. His wife, Gerda Bormann, was an ardent Nazi who not only bore him 10 children but also encouraged his infidelities in the name of producing more Aryan offspring. This large brood, often filmed frolicking with Hitler at the Ober Salzburg, was intended to be the model family for the future thousand-year Reich. However, the fall of the Bormann dynasty was swift and brutal. As the war ended, Gerda and her children fled to a mountain village in Italy, only for her to be arrested and later die of uterine cancer in 1946. It was in the aftermath of this tragedy that a remarkable transformation occurred. The children, left orphaned and carrying the heaviest name in Germany, were adopted by a Catholic priest. Martin Adolf Bormann, the eldest son named after his godfather Adolf Hitler, eventually became a Roman Catholic priest himself. His journey was one of profound post-war trauma and atonement. He spent his life traveling to Israel to meet Holocaust survivors, seeking forgiveness for the sins of a father he barely knew but whose legacy he bore. In stark contrast was the family of Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's vain and ambitious foreign minister. Ribbentrop, a man of aristocratic pretensions, was captured in Hamburg in 1945 and eventually became the first of the high-ranking Nazis to be executed at Nuremberg. His wife, Anneliese von Ribbentrop, however, remained a figure of unyielding aristocratic pride. She was a headstrong woman who many believed was the true driving force behind her husband's political career. Post-war, Anneliese fought the denazification courts with legal ferocity, managing to retain much of her family fortune by arguing it was inherited from her wealthy wine-producing father rather than looted state funds. Unlike the Bormann children, the Ribbentrop descendants maintained a sense of defiant loyalty to their father's memory. His eldest son, Rudolf von Ribbentrop, a highly decorated Waffen-SS officer, lived to the age of 98, passing away in 2019 without ever truly repenting for the regime he served. These two families represent the diverging paths of the Nazi legacy, one choosing the path of the Catholic Church and moral reconciliation, the other retreating into the silence of unrepentant privilege. Their stories highlight the deep psychological schism that defined the children of the Third Reich, a generation forced to reconcile the private memories of a loving parent with the public record of a mass murderer. While Eva Braun lived in the shadows, Emmy Göring basked in the spotlight as the undisputed First Lady of the Reich. An actress by profession, she played her greatest role as the elegant hostess for her husband, Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Goring. Their lifestyle was one of staggering decadence, centered around Harrenhal, a vast country estate that rivaled the palaces of old European royalty. Decorated with looted art from across occupied Europe and filled with the finest treasures, Harrenhal was a monument to the Gorings' greed and power. Emmy's disdain for Eva Braun was legendary. She viewed the Führer's girlfriend as a commoner, leading to a friction so intense that Hitler himself had to intervene to maintain a semblance of peace within his inner circle. At the heart of this gilded world was their only daughter, Edda Göring. Born in 1938, Edda was treated like a living doll by the entire Nazi state. Her childhood was a fever dream of luxury. She was showered with priceless gifts, including a 50-meter-long replica of Frederick the Great's palace, Sanssouci, built just for her to play in. Her father, a man responsible for the aerial destruction of cities, doted on her with a tenderness that stood in horrific contrast to his public actions. For Edda, the horrors of the war were invisible, masked by the high walls of her father's castles and the devotion of a family that remained remarkably faithful to one another, even as the Reich crumbled. The fall, when it came, was absolute. Following Goring's arrest and subsequent suicide by cyanide on the eve of his execution at the Nuremberg trials, Emmy and Edda were stripped of their status and much of their wealth. Emmy was imprisoned for a year during the denazification process and spent the rest of her life in a modest Munich apartment, far from the grandeur of Harrenhal. Edda, however, never wavered in her defense of her father's memory. Growing into an attractive and educated woman, she spent decades petitioning the German government for the return of her father's confiscated art collection, claiming it was her rightful inheritance. She remained a fixture in the old Nazi social circles of West Germany, often associating with former SS generals and unrepentant loyalists. Until her death in 2018, Edda Göring lived in the shadow of a man she remembered only as a loving father, proving that even the most extravagant First Lady could be reduced to a footnote in a history defined by the crimes of her husband. The story of the women and children of the Third Reich is more than a mere footnote in military history. It is a profound study in the endurance of human loyalty and the complexity of historical memory. For over 75 years, the descendants of men like Himmler, Goring, and Bormann have navigated a world that bears the scars of their fathers' actions. Their lives represent the ultimate psychological battleground, the struggle to reconcile the image of a doting parent with the reality of a war criminal. As we have seen, the paths they chose were as varied as the families themselves. Some, like Gudrun Himmler and Edda Göring, chose the path of defiance, spending their lives as keepers of the flame for a dead ideology. They lived in a perpetual state of denial, protecting the private man from the public monster. Others, like the Bormann children, chose the path of radical transformation, seeking through faith and public service to wash away the stains of their ancestral sins. Their lives serve as a living testament to the fact that while we cannot choose our lineage, we can choose our legacy. In modern post-war Germany, the echoes of these families are finally fading. With the deaths of Gudrun Himmler and Edda Göring in 2018, and Rudolf von Ribbentrop in 2019, the last direct links to the inner circle of the Obersalzberg have been severed. What remains is the lesson they left behind, that the gilded lives of the elite were bought at the cost of millions of lives, and that no amount of luxury can shield a family from the eventual reckoning of history. The nightmare ended in 1945, but the responsibility remains. If this exploration into the shadowed lives of the Nazi elite has moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into the untold stories of history. Your engagement helps us bring these complex narratives to light. We want to hear from you. Is it possible to separate the actions of a parent from the identity of a child? Can a name ever be truly redeemed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next chapter of history.